morning, everyone. Welcome to our Author Meets Reader with Professor Marcelo Neves. The session will be dedicated to present and discuss two of his recent published books by Oxford University Press, namely Constitutionalism and the Paradox of Principles and Rules, and the other one, Symbolic Constitutionalization. It may sound a bit biased, but these are two major books of Brazilian legal, social legal scholarship and constitutional scholarship. Today we will have, I will be organizing and sharing the session, so we will have the following proceedings. Professor Neves will present the book for about 20 minutes, and then we will have the readers, whom I would like to thank right now. Today we have a very diverse panel. Online with us, there are Professor Alphonse Porra and Lincoln Fontenele from Bielefeld University. Here, Stine Nielsen from the University of Southern Denmark. Luisa Hedler from Copenhagen Business School. Marcelo Moita from the Free University of Berlin. Francis Chow from Frankfurt University. Gilberto Guerra from the Max Planck Institute, also in Frankfurt. Some friendly faces, and Professor Matonio is here with us. João Costa, thank you very much for coming. And before we begin, I just want to say a few words about Professor Marcelo Neves, who got his PhD in 1991 in Bremen under the supervision of Professor Karl-Heinz Wader and Niklas Luhmann. He is widely known for his works on systems theory and legal theory, especially in Brazil, but I would say up there, say Latin America, and when we say, in the sense, when we talk about peripheral modernity, he is a quite known author who uses and applies in a very innovative, revealing way systems theory, although with some criticisms and reflection, and that's key features of his works, which I think we will see quite clearly in our discussion today. So I'll hand the floor to Professor Marcelo. So please.
Aqui tem que colocar. Fica para aqui. Tá certo. Good morning. First, I would like to thank Edvaldo Moita for organizing this session, and I also thank the reader. Symbolic is a very ambiguous word. When my strategy was to understand the meaning of symbolic in the context of the discussion about symbolic legislation in the 80s and 90s. Then, in this context, symbolic refers to displacement of meaning to another sphere of meanings. With this figure, we can see when a language is symbolic, the connotation prevails over denotation. The latent meaning prevails over the manifest meaning. Now to symbolic legislation. First, I would like to make clear that all legal norms have symbolic effects. Then we can verify here that we are confronted with displacement of legal meaning to another sphere of societal meanings and functions. We can see here again the notation of normative text is that which refer to legal meaning is outweighed by the denotation which refer primarily to a non-legal meaning, political meaning, value-based, moral or religious meaning. Again, latent function is more important, prevails over manifest function. But what is symbolic legislation? I define symbolic legislation as hypertrophy of the political symbolic function to the detriment of the legal normative force of a legal text or provision. And symbolic constitutionalization is a special case of symbolic legislation. The concept is similar, but the scope is a particular scope. Then I define symbolic constitutionalization as hypertrophy of the political symbolic function to the detriment of the legal normative force of the constitutional text or provision concerning fundamental rights, rule of law, separation of power, and democratic procedures. Other than symbolic legislation, symbolic constitutionalization has a comprehensive impact on the various spheres of the validity of law. In this way, symbolic constitutionalization impedes at the structural level the autonomy of the legal system. In this context, I have spoken of allopoiesis of law through symbolic constitutionalization. Two practical implications for legal system are important. First, the systemic corruption blockage of the law. In this figure, we can see economicization, politicization, medialization, and frenemy or nepotistic intrusions as the most influential factors of blocking the code legal illegal in the peripheral countries. And the symbolic, the systemic corruption in the context of peripheral modernity is directly related to social exclusion. But to speaking of social exclusion, I need to say what I understand under social inclusion. And here I define very strictly, in the sense of systems theory, state membership in organization, presence or not present in an interaction. It has to do with functional system. And inclusion, in the sense of a formulation of Luhmann, implies, means dependence on access to the benefits of social systems. In this sense, I have argued that there is exclusion not only when people has not access to the benefits of social system, that's the usual meaning, but also when people are not very limited, dependent of the legal social system. And then here I proposed two concepts of social exclusion, two forms best. The relationships of over-inclusion and under-inclusion. The over-included people have broad access to the benefits of social system and the condition of symbolic constitutionalization, but they are the dependence of them on these benefits are very limited. The under-included people are very dependent, but have very limited access to the benefits of social system. In the field of law, I have spoken of over-citizenship and under-citizenship. Over-citizen are treated by the legal system as someone that have primarily rights, and the over-citizen is treated by the legal system as someone that has primarily legal duties. My argument is that symbolic constitutionalization implies constitutional exclusion as primary problem in peripheral modernity. This means a blockage of the Constitution in political and legal practice. Symbolic constitutionalization implodes the Constitution as both as comprehensive, reflexive mechanism of the legal system and as structural coupling between the legal system and the political system. Then to the prospects, that is the structure of the book is telegraphic, but Brazil, we have the situation in Brazil indicates today a transition from symbolic constitutionalization to constitutional degradation. The Constitution is losing his symbolic force, and the possibility of the imposition of an instrumental constitution in the term of authoritarianism can be not excluded. The expectation of a reversion of this situation reside quite only in the victory of the democratic opposition in the election of October. In concerns the world society, we can verify a worldwide expansion of symbolic constitutionalization. Also over the democracies of Western Europe and North America. The Constitution is losing in this account also its normative force. And I spoke in this context from a paradoxical peripherization of the dominant center through symbolic constitutionalization. Whether this prospect will be confirmed is an open question, but the Western democracy overcoming this situation requires a radical transformation in the attitude of Western democracy to the other countries of world society. And this has to do with the work that I am working now, transdemocracy. Now to the second book. Okay. Now to the second book. I start I begin with a metaphor from the Greek mythology. I show that to kill the Hydra, Hercules needs the help of his nephew Iolaus. But I reverse the metaphor, the working metaphor. From my perspective, principles are related to the Hydra because they open the argumentative process. Rule serve more to close the argumentative process of concretization, and thus they are related to Hercules. In first chapter, I discuss critically the class distinction between legal principle and rule. I have no time here to. In the second chapter, I approach critically also the still dominant models of division between constitutional principle and rules, Ronaldo Duoque and Robert Alexi. Now to the third chapter. I begin with the argument that principle and rules are constitute an internal difference of the legal system. Principles are comprehensive at the static level. Principles are reflexive mechanism of the legal system. The normative reflexivity implies a circular relationship between principles and rules. In figure, we can see this circularity. Principle mark out, construct and develop, strengthen and weaken, restrict and extend the content of rules. But principle can only be applied to the ruling of a case if there is rule. They cannot be applied directly. The constitutional concretization takes place through principles and rules. The agents of concretization invoke principle and rule that is a selective process in which one will define which principle and rules will be applied. As we see here, principles are more serve more to the openness of the legal system, to the values, interests, moral claims, a typical normative expectation that circulate in society. Rules are more related to the ruling of the case and are subcomplex in relation to the environment of the legal system. Then balancing without optimization. My criticism in Alex has to do with this. My idea is principle as norm of norm correspond to different perspectives of observation of the legal order. In this sense, I maintain the idea of not optimizing comparative balancing because principles are incommensurable magnitudes. And there is no ultimate and privileged subject or intersubjective discourse of balance. In this way, a principle is the balancing, unlimited balancing in the search of optimization leads to the compulsion to optimizing balancing, that is Alex, leads to judicialization of parliamentary politics to detriment of democracy and the politicization of the judicial power to detriment of the rule of law and due process of law. Now, to inter-principle collision, double contingency and functional differentiation, which bring us to a complex theory of principles. The dominant principle theory assumes an under-complex social reality because they assume that the balance of principle is based on an Archimedean point. Then there is an oversimplification of the complex relationship between principle and rules. In my idea, there is different readings of the same principle by author and ego. First, the optimizing theory is not prepared to understand it. That is a basic authority of society and law. But also, principles vary according to the social sphere, we could say sphere of justice here, in which they are applied. Then it's not just about complex equality. The inter-principle collision that is not seen in the theory of Dworkin or Alex, this inter-principle collision implies not only complex equality, alter according you are in religion, system, or the economy, complex freedom, also complex human dignity, because there is different possibilities of interpretation. The abuse of principles in Brazil, the Brazilian constitutional doctrine was fascinated by the theory of principle that they overestimate principles to detriment and rule, and was involved in an unlimited balancing. This doctrinal fascination was followed by a confusing legal constitutional practice. Courts are disastrous when they always invoke principle as ultimate or the ultima ratio of the legal argumentation, and consider balancing as quite the only method of applying Constitution. My final comment, the paradox of justice between constitutional principle and rules. The paradoxical relationship between principle and rules are directly associated with the paradox of justice as formula of contingency, or contingency formula of the legal system. From this perspective of Niklas Luhmann's systems theory, there are two dimensions of justice. Internal justice, that is legally consistent decisions, and external justice, namely social, or better, complex adequacy of the legal system for society. Principles that are more related to the openness, and rules that are more related to the closure of the legal system, expresses this paradox at the normative level. To face this paradox, neither a Hydra-like judge nor a Herculean judge is suitable. To face this paradox, we need the jus iolaus. Jus iolaus seeks a balance, an unstable, contingent, precarious balance between principle and rule to improve at the same time, in this paradox, legal consistency and social adequacy of law. He's aware that this is very unstable, precarious, and contingent rationality, because the situation is open for future cases. Then I finished this work taking distance to Derrida idea, because the idea of justice as experience of the impossible. Jus iolaus is an experience with the improbable, here more in the sense of systems theory, not a negative metaphysics of the impossibility, but a contingent conception of this relationship between principles and rules. I offer this very telegraphic presentation to open our discussion. I thank Luisa, Hedler, Stine, Nielsen, Alphonse Bora, Franz Kau, Cristiano Moita, and Gilberto, Alphonse Bora, and Lincoln Fontenele for accepting to participate in this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Professor Neves. You did a great job in summarizing two difficult, dense, and articulated books. Now we will hand the floor to the readers. And as we agreed, we can start with Ms. Nielsen. So I will hand the floor to you.
Do you want me to come up there?
I think I can just move the camera with the microphone, so don't worry. Let me see if it works. I think so. They have one table. Perfect. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So as I understood, we had 10 minutes allocated. So would you be so kind to let me know about?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. And well, thank you to you, Professor Neves, for writing these books, and to Edvaldo for organizing and inviting me on board. I'm very grateful for that opportunity. And I focused on the book on the Hydra and the Hercules, so the last one that you presented here. And what I would like to do is to share my reflections on reading that book with you. And some of these reflections also led to some questions that I would like to share with you as well. And I don't know about the format. You can see if you want to ask them and we can discuss them now, or how we want to go about it. We can see. So in the introductory section, as you also mentioned in your presentation, you open up for the understanding of principles as taking on this Hydra-like character, because it invites for different interpretations. I really like the metaphor. It helps us understand your way into this. And then you offer the metaphor of the Hercules rules to, you could say, where the Hydra-like principles open for contingency, the Hercules rules offer closure to that contingency, right? And it helps us, in some way, stabilize the legal system and normative expectations to that. But it also made me think, what if rules take on a Hydra-like character? Because sometimes we see that in law, which is characterized by framework law, where it very much focuses on the objective of a legal source rather than if so. Just to offer an example, well, I'm from Denmark and my focus is on Danish social law. And sometimes in Danish social law, what you can read is that to offer social support to citizens in dire situations, the citizen situations need to be clarified. But what does that mean, clarifying? That opens up for contingency, because you can talk about clarification from a health perspective, from a social perspective, an economic perspective, right? So in that sense, it's perhaps possible to argue that sometimes rules can also take on a Hydra-like character. And what do we then do to offer closure to the argumentative process? That was, one reflection. So should I continue? Should we engage in discussion?
Well, perhaps if you want to pose all the questions and comments, it would be better. Yeah, so absolutely. We can control the time now or organizing the manner.
Okay, sure. There were many interesting points, but I tried to, narrow it down considering time. And in the book, you also look at law as legal texts, where you say that legal text alone cannot be characterized as law, because the formation of law is also depending on the binding norms that are assigned to them, meaning that the same constitutional text can actually result in different constitutional practices. And that actually made me think of texts, textualization of law, meaning that the formation of text, when we format text into law, it seems to me that this process is characterized by an always already different contingency or interpretation. And what is the implication of that for the stabilization of normative expectations? And the final reflection that I really want to share with you, I have others as well, but I think we should try to limit ourselves also. I think this phrasing of Judge Iulaus is a really relevant contribution to understand from a systems theory perspective, or to investigate from a system theory perspective, how we may stabilize normative expectations when we are in this paradoxical field of principles and rules. And reading through your description of this figure of Judge Eulaus, it made me think of if it's possible to understand your construction of the figure as a sort of semantic trick, like Luhmann does in his construction of semantic trick related to the person, the actor, and his systems theory.
Thank you very much. That was quite well organized. Should have passed out the votes everybody. Didn't mention the final.
Because he said I will speak.
Yeah, perfect. You have time, so you're okay. So, sorry, now we're going to listen Luisa Hedler.
Should I move?
Yes, it's better.
You listen there?
Yeah,
Can you listen?
they are nodding in the screen.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me well like this?
No, not here.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Makes it easier. Perfect. Yeah, that makes it better enough. Definitely. Thank you.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Professor Neves, for the very, very interesting and stimulating book. And thank you, Edvaldo, for the invitation. So I'm coming here to, in a way, discuss this book for a second time. Because 10 years ago, at the University of Brasília, I had the pleasure as a then law student to discuss with Professor Neves in a group about what the sort of very recently, the more recently formulated ideas was. And from our perspective then, 10 years ago, we were looking at, of course, deeply concerned and fully immersed in the ideas of what the Brazilian Constitution very specifically meant, and what it meant, for example, to at the time see the decisions that the Supreme Court were taking in a different government, in a different context, where in some ways this sort of overreach of principles was, in our eyes, being used for, in some ways, progressive objectives that we could agree with the direction that it was going, but that in some ways caused some alarm about exactly how those principles were being used. So now it is 10 years later, with a change of government, with a change of what we have experienced and seen the Brazilian Supreme Court going, and of course personally, from a change of perspective of having left Brazil to study, and on coming into contact with other different legal systems and different ways of also working with principles and rules. So I think one of the big merits of the book is that the discussion around principles, even though it is of course of extreme relevance in the Brazilian context, is something that travels quite well, is something that even though we might not have the same, we might not have, for example, in an European context, we might not have all the immensity of the Constitution as we have in the Brazilian Constitution. There are still, I mean, both in Europe and elsewhere, many important reflections about the role of principles and how exactly we contend to this dynamic between principles and rules. So, I mean, a few sparse examples where this becomes extremely relevant, for example, is in the recent US Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade, where suddenly we find ourselves from the perspective of reproductive rights, having a different answer about the meaning of privacy and what it means for healthcare. And we have, for example, in many other, especially in my field, which is the applications of technology to law, we have a lot of attempts of lawmaking related to principles that heavily rely on, for example, proportionality assessments, which have been featured in some way, which have been featured in an especially sort of complex place in the book, as in some ways as a meta principle, in some ways internalized as a rule to be followed, and all the openness and the complexity that comes with that. One of the things that strike me as especially useful from this perspective, from your particular perspective of explaining principles, is how the definition is not necessarily based on a sort of ontological typology, or even that something is called a principle, but rather that the principle appears as an action, as that principle is defined by what it does. And that sometimes something that is clearly written as a rule might give rise or act as a principle, and something that might be written as a principle can just act as a rule. And I think it is in this sort of, in a way, functional description of what a principle is that the main sort of general theoretical contribution of the book comes. And then I wanted to turn to sort of a more specific application that I have found, because I came to the book thinking that it was going to be sort of a departure and travel of the research that I usually make, but found myself getting quite a few reflections that are very applicable. So the one question that I came with was, well, could Judge Iolaus be a robot? Could this conception of advancement of technology, and with the presence of sort of substitutive technologies that come into the legal system in different steps, could we actually conceive of a legal system that would, could Judge Iolaus then be sort of substituted and become the Theseus ship of sort of legal technology in that sense? And the sort of, I mean, very tentative and very sort of unstructured answer that I would have to give to that is that when we think about the use of big data, it allows us to very efficiently, of course, come closer to the fulfillment of the first internal criteria of justice, that we are allowed, especially with using algorithms for legal research and for what we call a decision-making assistant, to achieve a level of internal coherence and consistency that we might have the difficulty doing otherwise. So in scoring through the immensity of data that one might have in a given legal system, and find then the answers that could potentially be the more internally coherent. But it is precisely on the sort of social, external level of coherence that we haven't yet been enabled to find that. And principles do play an enormous role in that. And maybe this is the reason why, when it comes to the regulation of tech, or attempts that we have seen, for example, in the Council of Europe, or even like in Brazil, attempts to regulate technology, that they start with principles, that they start with this notion that it is precisely in this contingency and with this contingency, in a way, allowance of the complexity and the contingency, but on the other hand, with the connection of the possibilities of firmness of the law, that we find the key to this attempt of regulating technology. However, in the specific field of trying to grapple with new technologies and how they might impact law, we find ourselves in a way in the opposite situation of the Brazilian constitution, where we have the proclamation of principles. We have, for example, to bring it in a concrete state, we have, for example, the European framework, that the proposal on AI that is based on principle of non-discrimination, principles of transparency, but at the same time, there is a lack of specific rules, or there's a lack of firmness, especially that happens especially because of how quickly technology evolves, that might stop in a way or hinder the lawmaking that might be relevant, say 2 years, right, 2 years after. So I think this would be an interesting, since the initial provocation for your book was a situation where there was sort of a Hydra mayhem, and where Hydra was a mayhem, and one would need to cut off the heads of the Hydra in order to find some internal consistency and not weaken the legal system. I think my main question for you would be, what are then the possibilities when the opposite is around, where there is very little or almost no Hercules, and there is only a baby Hydra to deal with some other monster or with some other entity, or where Hercules is incapacitated in that way. What would be the perspectives that you would give to that? Otherwise, in my sort of 1 minute that I have some questions more as a reader about the writing process, because this is also fascinating. The use of system theory that you have put, and how you have, at least my feeling as a reader, interwoven it into the narrative without necessarily being normative of saying, I am using system theory, or I am denying this and denying that, but rather than it flowed and picking up, looking at, and then discarding parts of different theories. In the same way that you look at Habermas and working, dissect them, take away what you think is inappropriate, but ultimately, in the end, recover some sense of, I think, especially when it comes to the limits that you give, that the limits of the reproduction of a system, that you dress in a way Luhmann's only quasi-normative requirement of the differentiation of the system, but you add to them a sort of deconstructed and reconstructed working idea of the necessity, or even Habermasian idea of the necessity of keeping the openness or the possibility of plurality that I wouldn't necessarily directly attribute to. So my first question is, how was the working of theory? How was sort of the writing journey between the situational provocation to the application of system theory, and then to the choice of sort of choosing and intermingling the theories that you did? So I think those are my questions. Thank you so much for writing this book and for the discussion.
Thank you very much. A lot of thoughtful insights. Now we have the comments of Francis.
Should I be here? All right. Yes, it's okay. It's okay. Hopefully everyone can hear me, so I can continue. All right. Thanks so much.
Are you listening?
Can you guys follow me? Is it receivable right now?
Is it okay? Professor Alphonse, can you hear him?
Right. Everyone gotcha? Perfect. So, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Edvaldo. Thanks so much, Professor Neves. I feel like this seems a little bit unnecessary right now, as two of the commentators has already posed their very brilliant comments about Professor Neves' book. But I guess I'm still obliged to add a few pens if it's still worth it. It's a great pleasure to say at first, I've known Professor Neves actually for years through this very interesting encounter at all style of conferences, and also have this pleasure of working at this in between from a couple of Chinese scholar to translate one of Professor Neves' work into Chinese. It's very interesting for me personally to see Professor Neves' work as this very interesting critical spot I say critical, I say in both sense. It's very important, but also being very critical in this the reception of this theory in a world that is larger than Europe. And by doing that, that kind of brings me to the point I'm trying to make right now. That is about the book which I'm assigned to great and common, and then there's the constitutionalism and the paradox of principle and rules. Actually, I was a little bit like surprised because I started about another book, as that was actually the first one I read from Professor Neves, but that was the German version, the German translation. But finishing this, it kind of gave me a better picture of Professor Neves' whole journey of thoughts as as a esteemed professor who has his career over certain years. He's gathers words, he's gathers thread of thoughts ranging from early 1990s to now. And this one, from what I take, kind of carries out his more recent, let's say more on the spot critiques of what is going on in constitutional interpretation. For first, it is about something happening in Brazil, but for me, it's also something that has this global relevance. So I've got basically 3 points to make because of the time. So talking about this principle and rules and the differences in between, it kind of reminds me of this very old figure of speech called yin and yang. And as same as this figure of speech yin and yang, the way Professor Neves characterizes principles and rules emphasize on the differences in between, but also the kind of interaction in between. In his own words, he characterized it as a matter of circular process. But by saying that, it kind of resembles this old ways of talking about chaos and the way out of chaos, which is from the very original position of the way it was to the way that between this black and white, so to speak, yeah, whatever it is. That is to create this distinction and make sure this kind of differentiation keeps going. That brings me to the first point of the comment. I think in this book, what Professor Neves is trying to propose is a sociological theory of constitutional law. And different from others, I think Professor Neves outlined a little this sociological theory of constitutional law, by which not only rules, but also principles are seamlessly interwoven. But on top of that, he kind of established this whole argument on the premise that is constitutional principles are the consequence of legal positivization, which is also the topic of his another book. It is at the same time a very brilliant remark of this whole work, but also I guess one of the things that I guess that will draw a lot of different opinions. But I will carry from that. I think from my own take, this take is interesting. It's kind of associated. I guess we can't get from that. The point this take is interesting is kind of made. Let me borrow this very harmless style quote. It all happens at the moment of joy. In this whole process, processual ways of thinking about time, in Hamlet's own words, there are moments that things get out of joint. This continuity, the flow of time will disrupt. And that is exactly the moment the constitutional intervention, let's say, in this case, the judges from constitutional court made the intervention. And that is also somehow push us to think about these internal differences between rule and principle, and also this connection in that. By saying that, let me bring this to the second point I'm trying to bring. That is my own reflection of this very great and also very challenging the can that Professor Neves has made about this sort of positivization of constitutional principles. I think what Professor Neves is trying to clarify is actually the criticability of constitutional law, or say constitutional legal theories. By saying that, I'm talking about the possibility of building this immanence inside the whole theory of constitutional law framework, of constitutional law scholarship. It's difficult, as we all know. If it goes through the work, Professor Neves has outlined several most maybe brilliant legal scholars. Joaquin, for example, Alexei, for example, they all try to handle this problem, although like in very different ways. In the US context, of course, it is kind of difficult. It is kind of associated with the US legal scholarship as a whole, which was kind of constructed in a very different way. And I'm not going to far into that. And it's also we got German law professor here, so we can kind of see how Alex's argument is kind of associated with frame in the stream of thought. But I think the most exciting point that Professor Neves has made is exactly to what degree this immanence is possible. Because as we all know, it's kind of ruled out in the US context. As we all know how politicized the course is right now. It's not only a matter of principle, which is in the case of Brazil, as Professor Neves has picked it up, there was this Hydra of principles and interpretations. In the US, I have to say maybe in Rome is also a matter of highly politicized area. Now there are discussions about how better to pack the court again, how to terminate the tenure again, as it happened in 1930s at the era. So when now looking at this increasing politicization of this constitutional law, which is I guess this constitutional scholarship, which I think by its own definition is a part of that. But for the moment that it kind of we're mostly used to the existence of this politicization in this process. But what is frustrating right now is a possibility of immanence, because it's so difficult to build this internal critique from this end. And I think that is why the major argument Professor Neves has made in this book is quite interesting. Okay, let me go to the third point. That is my own way, that is, I call it the way forward. So starting from what Professor Neves has achieved right now, where are we going? I got at least two stream of thoughts I think that's worth considering. The first has some relation with the Hydra of the principles. When it comes to inflation, so to speak, because as we know, the Hydra of principles, if you use some economic metaphor, it's inflation. I think someone from social system theory will now try to argue for austerity, which is proven as a very unsuccessful measure. Quite on the contrary, we're trying to push for more. So that brings us to the point of researching constitutionalization not only inside the state, but also as partner has been in this Gesellschaft. And also moreover to see this internal conflicts that is currently unfolding inside the Gesellschaft, which I guess is very much interesting. We're not only talking about the judicial dialogue, so to speak, between the European Union countries, where human rights support in South America. But now we're seeing more cases of conflicts, of tensions happening between major economies, happening between European countries. And that is also a crucial side for us to bring in as a Neves' argument. Let it be there are, let it be, like the Hydra of principle. Now the problem is how there is a way in which we can push forward constitutionalization so that the Hydra, the wiles of the Hydra, can be cured by the wiles of constitutionalization. And my second argument goes to the introduction of so-called rule-based argument in this whole monogram. As Professor Neves has pointed out, it is always misplaced. It is misplaced for the extension of principles in constitutional courts and its interpretations. But the moment that I try to relate this rule-based argument with another realm that I guess is crucial here, that is conflict. The law of conflict and also the institution that address conflicts. It brings us to the idea that is used to be very marginal, like legal theories that they become conflicts of interest. It's very technical in a way. But now we have seen some tendencies in which people try to institutionalize this conflict of interest in a higher standard. But doing that, it kind of echoes what Professor Neves has the point that he has made in the book. We have been paying too much attention to principle and literary interpretation about these cases. Although I have to say, your point also makes sense, especially in terms of health care and also social law. But in the case I'm trying to refer to is more about constitutions, is more about international law. We have seen the efforts.
I'm sorry to interrupt the system because I have to control.
Oh, right. I'm right now in 30 minutes. These efforts of institutionalizing conflict of interest across the world. There, I guess, the distinction between principle and rules, and also the reintroduction of this circular relationship can be of great help. That's basically my
okay. Thank you very much. Now, moving forward, we have the comments of Marcelo Moita.
Yes, a new other book.
Yeah, the other book. No, that's all. No, it's in the one. Okay. No?
Just also control my time. Well, good morning, everyone. So, in the first place, I have to thank Edvaldo Moita for organizing these sessions. It's a fascinating format, having the opportunity to discuss precisely these books with the author is an honor. So I'm also glad to be here with such amazing people, researchers and professors. So it was really insightful to hear the first comments on between Hydra and Hercules by Nielsen, Hedler, and Cow. So far I've been subjected to a brainstorm of fruitful insights, and for that I'm really thankful. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, and finally I want to thank Professor Neves for the presentation, of course for the books, because that's the reason why we are here, and for being here sharing your thoughts with us. So, yeah. Having only 10 minutes, I decided to cast two considerations on the experience I had with the book Symbolic Constitutionalism. So in the first part, I'm going to comment on a research project I carried out in Brazil with some researchers on possible outcomes of the idea of symbolic constitutionalism. I'm going to show some cases and eventually some conclusions we have drawn out of this project. Then I want to address Professor Neves some reflections. I'm looking forward to hearing from you your reply. So my first consideration about the research project we had in Brazil. So 3 years ago, more or less 2018, 2019, I carried out this investigation with 3 researchers about symbolic constitutionalism. Its name was Symbolic Effects of Legislation and Constitution, Possible Uses, Misuses, and Abuses of the Text. So the objective was to find signs or evidences of symbolic constitutionalism, and our plan had the following structure. First, we had a long year for this project. First, we had to read thoroughly the book, eventually some papers and books that were mentioned by you in your book. And second, we had to start an investigation about concrete phenomena in the Brazilian legal reality and to analyze them through the lenses of the theoretical feature, symbolic constitutionalism. Each researcher would have to investigate one. So the research group lasted 1 year, at the end of which each researcher could produce some papers and eventually some projects of investigation. So the book produced a lot of outcomes in terms of academic production. And in fact, the first thing we had, we agreed at that time was that the book could articulate the international legal and sociological debate, legal philosophical and sociological debate with concrete problems of reality. So that's something very interesting in your books actually, because you can, so your thoughts might produce some consistency between theory and practice. That was really, so our first step was to agree on that. So at that time, we had some very curious cases going on in our, so to speak, legal milieu at a local level and at a national level, and to some extent at an international level. So first at a local level, we had at that time a case of corruption in the judiciary of our state, of our federal state, in Brazil, so in Ceará, Brazil. 3 judges in our court of appeal were being accused of receiving bribes to sell the sentences. Some other cases of corruption were going on afterwards, but there was a sign or evidence of symbolic constitutionalism in the way I'm going to present. So second, at a national level, we were at that time in the middle of the biggest turmoil in our recent political history, with beginning with the impeachment of President Dilma in 2016, and the series of events afterwards, like the election of the Operation Car Wash, the election and eventually the prison of former President Lula, and eventually the election of President Bolsonaro. In our constitutional court, and by extension our constitutional debate, were in the middle of this turmoil. So that was the second case at the national level, what was going on in the constitutional debate. At the third level, so the third case, more or less national but also international, was the fact that the important, at that time, political information was being transmitted by the social media, no longer the traditional media. In the year 2017, the expression fake news won the prize of Collins Dictionary, and we were at the time of fake news. And fake news also arrived in not only the political, but also in the legal discourse. So we have these 3 cases: a local case, a national case, and also a national, more or less, international case. I don't have so much time. I'm going to focus on the first 2 cases. So the case, the local case had a curious name, which was Express 150, but Express 150. That means the reason was the 3 judges were used to charge actually 150,000 reais, more or less like 30,000 euros, to sell their sentences. There was a very established hearsay in the corridors of the court, and also in the lawyers' milieu, about the black suitcase. So everybody knew more or less. Some didn't know exactly what was going on. Some knew, but wouldn't like to stir up the hornet's nest. They wouldn't like to produce some commotion. It was something that everybody knew, so to speak. But the tricky thing here was the fact that in Brazil it is also a very common criticism to say that judges' decisions are not very well justified, right? So they are kind of generic, without specific considerations regarding the case. So our hypothesis was that because of the well-known scarcity in the justification of the normal habeas corpus, that was the case, it could be very likely that this justification could be found in the habeas that were sold. And that is precisely what we found. So the justifications were kind of correct. That is the point. So what could be the difference between the correct way of applying the legal and constitutional texts to the cases and the corrupted way of applying the same texts to the cases. One possible first conclusion was that judges would not only use the constitutional texts, but also misuse them consciously for economic purposes. In other words, they would incorporate the pair having and not having in the legal argumentation. The odd thing here is that they were applying the law. So in that case, we try to characterize this as one possible effect of the symbolic constitutionalization, which was we coined this term the symbolic judicial decision, that kind of misuse or abuse the legal text by a corrupted concretization of the legal text, alongside with a subtle influence of the economic system, something that was contributed to the ongoing allopoiesis of the Brazilian legal system, which you explained in the chapter 3 of the book. The corruption of the judiciary in these terms specifically, therefore, would be a sign or evidence of the ongoing allopoiesis of the legal system. So that was the first case. The second case, I'm going to be brief here, that brings me to the turmoil in the constitutional debate of the recent years. In some situations, there were pragmatic struggles towards the semantic of constitutional words. So I'm going to repeat this. So there were pragmatic struggles towards the semantic of the constitutional text, the semantic of words found in the constitutional text. Eventually in Brazil, our constitutional judges and politicians and the people were fighting for some constitutional words. Yeah, so for instance, the concept of democracy, the concept of innocence, the concept of res judicata, or última instância, trânsito julgado, res judicata, the competence of the president in choosing its ministers and so on. So all of these words were subjected to this political struggle. And the role of the army, for instance, in our constitutional design, and so on and so forth. So the conclusion we draw in the group was the following one. That might be understood also as a sign or evidence of the ongoing allopoiesis. In that case, not from the economic pair, but from the political pair. So it was, however, connected with the theoretical device, allopoiesis. Plus, it was also connected with your theoretical devices, erosion of the Constitution and the degradation of the Constitution, which we expand in the Oxford University Press edition. So, and I come to my consideration in questions to end my intervention. So, all of these signs or evidences point to something that I like to call to an instability of expectations. That's not a stability, it's instability of expectations. So we are in a kind of a phase of instability of expectations, of normative expectations. So what will be the current signs? And I want to bring you to the current days. What will be the current signs or evidences of the erosion or even the degradation of the Constitution that you see nowadays? On the other hand, how do you see this Brazilian problem of erosion or degradation of the Constitution as a problem for the road constitutionalism? So to finish, I just would like to stress my wish that these books spread worldwide and that constitutional thinking worldwide must open its eyes to these concrete social problems that interfere in the constitutional theoretical thinking. So thank you so much for that.
Okay, thank you, Michel. It was very interesting cases and applications. Now we move forward to Professor Alphonse Boyer. All right. So I will just move the camera here. I think you can have a. All right, we can begin. Huh?
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to speak about Marcelo's book today, which I will do with the greatest pleasure, of course. The scientific relevance of Marcelo's symbolic constitutionalization stems, amongst many other merits, from the fact that it can be understood as an approach towards critical legal thinking from the position of sociological systems theory. When published in German, 1998, it was, in other words, an early intervention, a very early intervention against a certain overemphasis on systemic autonomy in the autopoietic systems theory of law. Although there had been approaches since the 1970s in legal consequentialism, in responsive legal dogmatics and reflexive law, these debates, however, had often been framed as epistemological ones to a certain extent. Marcelo's book, in contrast, takes a more substantive view, speaking about material, legal, constitutional problems, thereby exemplifying the possibility of critique from a systems theoretical point of view. Marcelo certainly stands out as one critical reader of Luhmann's work. From his critique of Luhmann's theory of world society, he has not only derived the concept of peripheral modernity, moreover, his view that the constitutionalization processes in the periphery are symbolic in character and cover up structural deficits and inequalities further supports a critical perspective. The later works on transconstitutionalism lie along this line of demarcation from Luhmann on the one hand, and an engagement in the worldwide debate on constitutional sociology, which is definitely influenced by systems theory on the other. Well, regarding symbolic constitutionalization, in a nutshell, my suggestion is to support the argument of the book by slightly redirecting it, namely away from society and its subsystems towards organization. Symbolic constitutionalization in Marcelo's book is closely linked to processes of juridification on the one hand and of politicization on the other. The notion of allopoietic constitution, of allopoiesis of law, means politicization, strictly speaking, characterized by a fundamental lack of operative autonomy. This describes determination from outside, direct intervention, and influence from external reality. In other words, the superimposition of external codes. Superimposition is my term for what Marcelo just called displacement. It's a synonym. Überlagerung instead of Ersetzung, a slightly different metaphor. I would like to address some conceptual implications of this theoretical term, namely the superimposition of codes in form of scientification, politicization, juridification, economization, etc. Some problems in the common version of such terms stem from the type of social systems to which they are applied, that is, in general, functional subsystems of society. The phenomenon of superimposition thereby becomes relatively unspecific and invites generalizations of all kinds. In a certain way, it turns into an empty formula for analysis of contemporary times, Zeitdiagnose. Speaking about juridification, politicization, and the like, there is literally no phenomenon anymore that cannot be observed legally, but at the same time as politically, economically, scientifically, etc. Uno actu. The multicentricity and multi-perspectivity of modern society results directly from its functional differentiation. In other words, if one assumes universally operating functional systems, superimposition at the societal level is difficult to conceptualize because the codes, in a sense, always superimpose each other anyway. One can observe any phenomenon from several such points of view at the same time. Superimposition, in other words, merely points to the multicentricity of society on the level of social theory, as far as orthodox Luhmannians would argue. As I would like to suggest in contrast, the term will gain greater depth of focus as soon as it will be applied to organizations. There, it allows for very instructive insights, especially if it is tied back to functional system-related distinctions. Organizations are the most important instrument of coupling and binding functional systemic communications to the observation of the environment. In so doing, they enable external influence. That role is related to one of their essential properties, which also forms the key to describing superimposition phenomena, namely multi-referentiality. Phenomena of superimposition in organizations are the result of organizational multi-referentiality, which in principle makes code overlaps possible in the first place. Decisions as elements of organizational systems are programmed, among other things, by observing functional system codes. In this sense, organizations orient themselves to function systems. Such priorities of programming make us speak about organizations of law, of politics, of science, and so on. Above this primary orientation, however, such programming is always fundamentally mixed, always constitutionally in a way. In public administrations, for instance, this means the programming by law, power, but also knowledge or money. The organizations of the judiciary, constitutional courts or whatever you think of, primarily produce legal decisions. However, they do so at the same time with a view to economic or political communications, which are then communicated within the organization as restrictions in funding, ministerial directives, or the like. The university, to mention another example, is an organization of the science system programmed to enable and produce truth communications. But its decision-making programs are also very multifaceted. They are based on power, no doubt on power, law, and increasingly, obviously, on a money orientation, as well as on an observation of public attention in the system of mass media. And beyond that, universities are also organizations of the education system, for which one can observe comparably mixed relationships, complexities of all kinds. Well, against this theoretical background of multiple programming, multi-referentiality, there can be shifts in organizational programming priorities, which are then in turn reacted to internally within the organization. It is here that we can speak in the strict sense of politicization, juridification, scientification, etc., depending on which primary orientation is overlaid by which other. Superimposition phenomena occur when the primary reference of an organization is replaced by an other reference. This is obviously different from the colonization of society as a whole, or even just the life word or functional subsystems, but it is at the same time an empirically tangible level. At a given organization, it will be possible to observe the programming of decisions very easily. Corresponding hierarchies between references are usually simple to describe, as are shifts in these hierarchies. That's what all the empirical cases mentioned before hint to. This provides us with a clearly defined sociological concept of superimposition. The controversy about social differentiation is sometimes based on a mixture of phenomena typical of organizations on the one hand, and statements related to society as a whole on the other. It can therefore, at least from a systems theory perspective, be neutralized in some points through terminological clarifications. For a good part of the emphasis with which the autopoietic systems theory is sometimes argued against disregards the central relevance in systems theory of different types of social systems. Building on this relevance, the observation of processes of politicization, juridification, scientification, etc., becomes more precise. As a result, the observation of allopoietic influence in legally programmed organizations does not speak against the assumption of autopoietic unity and the accompanying differentiation. Rather, it is precisely this theoretical perspective that enables an understanding of empirical problems arising in connection with politicization processes, and that can only be made understandable with the help of the assumption of systemic unity. Coming back to symbolic constitutionalization, I would like to say that we can obviously and emphatically share the intention of criticizing superimposing processes of politicization and economization of legal communications in various empirical fields without any necessity to dismiss operative autonomy on the level of society as well as of organizations. However, such autonomy takes empirically varying forms which enable us to identify, reconstruct, and eventually to criticize structural solutions in a given case. Interestingly, and perhaps coming closer to Marcelo's intentions, critique is possible from such a theoretical point of view, namely as structural critique, as sociologists of organization have shown, Sven Kette and Veronika Tucker in 2002. In the light of such considerations, finally, Marcelo's book, once again, is a rich source of innovative and fruitful theoretical developments in the sociological theory of law. And it was with greatest pleasure, therefore, that I reread the work for today's discussions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now we'll hand the floor to Lincoln, the listeners. All right, so the word is yours.
Okay, that's fine. So can you hear me well, right? Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, Edvaldo. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you, at least using the Zoom app. But I'd like to work on my presentation in a very quick and simple way. And I will try to describe some aspects of the Brazilian labor reality, and also try to find out whether the concept of symbolic constitutionalization is useful in this effort or not. I can ask if you agree about my conclusion that I make here, and there is no problem with that, because I want to speak, but also I want to hear from you as well, of course, if it's possible. And actually, I want to bring some empirical situation to test the hypothesis of one thing that I call symbolic labor law. And my presentation is simple as that. Of course, I don't have time to explain and to bring a lot of numbers about the cases here in Brazil, so you may forgive me of this aspect. However, I think we still can work on the application of the concept of symbolic constitutionalization to describe this situation in Brazil regarding labor law. There are some cases in Brazil in which labor rights are not so effective. And what do I mean? But the best question is, what do I do not mean? In Brazil, as far as I understand, the labor law is quite effective when we are talking about the decisions of labor courts. And I mean, the law system has its operational code working pretty well there. This is not the problem. The problem is until you get a labor court decision, labor rights are not respected in many, many cases. So we have problems with like forced labor relations, problems like child work, like informal workers, and like social dumping, which happens in Brazil, but also in other countries from Europe. For instance, this case of social dumping is very clear for me, as I saw in the lawsuits that I read. Employers, in this case of social dumping, avoid paying labor rights to achieve a better place in the market. And in Brazil, most of labor relations do not have protection against dismissal. So if you ask for any labor right on labor courts, it means that you can be dismissed and so on. So, for instance, I had a recent experience about this. As a labor lawyer in Brazil, I got a case with the employee worked for 25 years and never received his labor rights. Besides that, the employment relationship was never made official. So now this employee wants his retirement, and but the whole social security system never saw him as an employee. This is a big problem. Now that the employee is 70 years old and needs the retirement, it cannot work anymore. So what can I do here? I need to ask for a judicial decision to recognize this employment relation. After that, I have to ask for another decision to ask for the retirement. What I'm trying to describe here, you can say that I'm wrong, but there is a very clear scenario here. As far as the employer can use the economic force, he can buy the lack of an effective labor right for many, many years. The non-compliance situations in Brazil is possible to be something that you can buy in the market. The non-compliance situation in the labor rights. However, until you have a judicial decision, the worker in Brazil did not have the access of the labor rights. The case of social dumping is very clear about that because the social dumping disrespect labor rights to have more money and to achieve a better place in the market than other companies. So the economic system takes advantage of this lack of normative force of law. And only in the future, this is the kind of risk that companies can buy. Only in the future, the employee can ask anything in the labor court, and it's something that can buy the market as a company. I mean that the economic system is working on some pressure of law on the law's differentiation because the economic power of the employer can buy the maintenance of an employee without some labor rights. And this is the kind of scenario that is hard to find another job in the case of dismissal. Because I have this job here in this company, but if I ask in the court some labor rights, the employer can kick me off of this job. And I prefer to not ask for anything until I really need. And I put in risk my job for this. So every time when I think about this problem, I remember of a speech of a professor of mine during my master's degree. So one day I was in the faculty of sociology in Ceará. My master's degree was in law, but I attended some disciplines in the faculty of sociology. And my professor there was talking about safety in the city of Fortaleza. So he was talking about some space in Fortaleza city where there are no safe, this kind of streets that are not safe to be. So one student there raised her hand and said, "Professor, excuse me, let me say one thing. I am a policy officer. I work there, and when I am there, people say they feel safe." And the professor said, "Okay, repeat again. Look, only if you are there, people are feeling safe. This is the public safety is not working well. It's failed." So the professor said this, and every time when I'm talking about labor law, I remember this case because labor law in Brazil seems that only works when you have in the end of this relation some kind of judicial decision. So why do I bring this kind of situation to our meeting today? I'm trying to conclude that to the case of labor rights in Brazil, if labor rights are only respected when you have a formal lawsuit, and it means for me that the labor law has failed, because all of these years you are not receiving your labor rights, and you cannot expect only the future. If you can get your labor rights, it has only a little bit of risk, of course. So if we have a labor law system, this is my conclusion here. If we have a labor law system where it is possible to avoid compliance with labor law, and if we have a law system that allows that economic force can buy this non-compliance situation at the same time, the economic system takes advantage of this non-compliance situation, and maybe we are talking about some kind of symbolic labor law. This is the proposition that I made here. So of course you can talk. I will hear to say that is it possible to take a symbolic labor law in Brazil, considering this non-compliance situation and considering that the labor law are quite effective only at the end of the process? and considering the circumstance that the economic force can buy this lack of normative force of labor law. So this is the speech that I prepared for today. Thank you very much for inviting me again, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Fica rápido, eu estou cansado de
Thank you very much, Lincoln. Now we're skipping ahead. We have Gilberto Cavara. Please, Gilberto Guerra.
So thank you all. Thanks, Edvaldo, for this privilege, and Professor Marcelo Neves being here as an intruder to the panel, but it's always a great moment to speak with you or share ideas. So my role here is more to share an idea that I have after rereading some works of Professor Neves, and thinking that the work, it's very most of the quotations and references that I found in Europe or Brazil that made to the two theses that I will comment here. I will focus on the symbolic constitutionalization and symbolic force of human rights. They are very cherry-picking. So they are very based on, like, I don't know, during the 90s, the problems that Europe were facing with the constitutionalization of the European Union, or in Brazil, like professors, leading scholars, they are trying to give a kind of to define what would be the project of the Constitution of 1988 in Brazil. So, and I think there is still a little explored aspect of Marcelo Neves' work regarding these two theses. There is the historicity of his social legal theories of constitutions and human rights. So, because it is a theory that passed by, like, and reflect problems that we face in the world society during the 20s and the 21st century. And I'm trying to organize, I don't know if it's a work in progress of an article, a project of research that will try to recover this debates, the overcoming misunderstandings about these theories. And I'm trying to outline an agenda for the history of law, legal history, based on this these two theses, the symbolic constitutionalization and symbolic force of human rights. So, and I'm following this appreciation for mythological metaphors, trying to bring up the figure of Clio, which is the muse of history, as an indispensable participant for a fruitful relationship between Themis and Leviathan. So, why symbolic constitutionalization, symbolic force of human rights? I think both of these theses offer a connection between a very refined theoretical constitutional innovation, like theory, in theory per se, and working at the same time in the realms of constitutional or regional level, and international, more in the global law level. And I think it's it's mostly the methodological part of the theories, the thesis, are these ambivalence of the symbolic. And I will touch a little bit on these points in the end for my questions, but I think these two theses have two very specific questions, and I see a potential to expand, not because the constitutionalization of symbolic constitutionalization, the symbolic force of human rights, they're trying to answer specific questions for our contemporary society, in our contemporary world society, and I think they have a potential to bridge problems historically that and to reconstruct these problems, connecting past, present, and a little bit like what we are facing in our contemporary world. So I think I will be very brief, and now I will end with questions, a little bit provocative. Is how, Professor Neves, how do you reflect about these two the two historical assumptions that you have in your work that permeates your work on the emergence of world society in the 16th centuries, in which, roughly speaking, in the case of Brazil and Latin America, is grounded on colonial exploitation and imperialism from the West, and the constitutional history from 19th, 20th century and now the beginning of 21st century in the context of peripheral countries, and its difficult position on anticipating the problems lived by the central countries right now, but also undermined as peoples destined to a sort of Sisyphal destiny, forever matching the standards of liberal democracy projects, or nowadays being always assisted by anti-liberal ones that show a powerful path in a equal level. And the second question would be, can you tell us a bit more in what extent exploring these ambivalences of the symbolic forces of normativities, which are the moral, political, or the hegemonic political economic ones, can be a more adequate theoretical framework than the ones mainly focused on unveil the contradictions of apologies and utopias, nowadays a trend among constitutional internationalist scholars, or even the ones that are trying to reconstruct a strict materialist theory of law in an equal measure to criticize this, the mainstream now. They are very much focused on law and economics and development. So I will finish here.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your comments and readings. We are a bit out of time, so I would just suggest the following. As we have some participants here, if you want to add some comments, something, then we can make this a huge blog. And of course, then you can answer.
Do you still have more time for some comments or remarks?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be recorded, so we do not have any session afterwards. So, in this sense, you can say a bit more.
I do have to leave.
Yeah, of course. So the ones who have to leave, you can leave. Don't worry. This will be recorded, then you can grab rest of the answers later. No? Don't worry.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, I'm the one to thank you all. Yeah.
If you have one time when Marcelo comes back, I'll have some comments, some remarks.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so let's just.
If it's possible.
Yes.
Like the thing will be uploaded somewhere, right?
Yes, I can send you. Yeah, don't worry. Yeah, I know you have all the meetings and.
Come see it.
Yeah. So I suggested the following, Professor. There are some people that have other meetings, no? Yes. So they can leave. You have the answers recorded, so I can give them the video, so they will know what. Professor Martoni, please.
So thank you very much. It's just a remark, Marcelo, to your spectacular speech, which I think is very important. First of all, I would like just to say, yes, it's very important. I think the point you touched about the overestimation of principles we have in Brazil, kind of that some scholars have already counted more than 92 principles all over. I don't know why this tragedy has come to us after our very good constitution, and they transform the constitution in that kind of self-consciousness. They decide like they think, and they transform that into a principle. That's a really tragedy of the gods, and we have to try to find another kind of explanation in this. But the point that I would like, it's a kind of provocation to hear from you like that, goes on the following matter. We have, of course, internal systems of law, especially on human law, due process of law, those liberal Western patterns of democracy. And of course, we receive that in our countries and in our constitutions. And then from the outside political and international systems, this is claimed to be in our country, to be done, to be effective. But what we see at the same time in the international level, that this is just nothing. In the last month, for example, we have the only country who granted freedom to Edward Snowden was Russia. We saw the judgment of Julian Assange. We saw the attacks of the Americans free in just 1 week on rights and liberties in the Supreme Court because there is a conservative majority, a kind of simple political appointment. And we have this week the former advisor of President Donald Trump saying that they help to organize camps all over the world. I mean, and we have a very strong critics on the Polish court who said that the European law here is just like nothing. And the Polish court said, well, the German Federal Constitutional Court can say that, but I can't say that. Talking about the decision on the European Central Bank in 2021. So we saw this kind of dialogue, we saw this kind of deficit. And how can we explain this kind of horizontal verticality between the systems? And what more, to try to understand that better than to judge that, but to try to understand the mechanism, the mechanic we had in this kind of systems, and to understand the malfunctioning of law systems. On one hand, at the international level, and on the second hand, also international level, which of course Brazil is not an exception. That's what I would like to hear from you, is it possible?
Thank you very much. But please, your name?
My name is Lasha. I have two questions to Professor Neves. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you for your presentation, for your books, for your amazing ideas. First of all, I understand systems theory as a theory based on distinctions. So when we propose...
Lasha, I'm very sorry for interrupting.
I think that you have close.
Can you please come forward and close, you don't mind?
You are the camera.
Tem que ser rápido, porque está passando já.
Sorry for that. I am sorry for this unplanned intervention. But when I have a chance to ask a question to Professor Neves, I have to use this chance. So my question to you, when you speak about symbolic constitutionalization, what is the other side of this process? What is the opposite to a symbolic constitutionalization? Is it factual constitutionalization or material constitutionalization? How you designate the opposite to symbolic constitutionalization? And the second question is a more broad question. Your idea about peripheral modernity, which is an amazing idea, and thank you for this idea. But do you think that we need another theory of society which would analyze the processes going on in the peripheral modernity, or one general universal theory of society proposed by Luhmann is sufficient? I mean a book written by Helmut Rica almost 35 years ago, Systemtheorie entwickelter Gesellschaften, systems theory of developed society, where he made this very strange divide between developed societies and undeveloped societies. So my question to you, we need one universal theory of society, or we need two different theories of society, one for developed, for central core countries of modernity, and the other for theory for peripheral modernity.
Thank you very much. Let me just suggest you the following, Professor. I know you are a bit tired and we are out of time, so you can just select some answers. And the other one, in terms of the other questions and answers, we can record a video afterwards and integrate everything.
I try to give answer now. First, for Stine, I don't understand problem. The difference of principle and rule, according to my conception, has not to do with imprecision of Zenor. Imprecision is not my argument. It means that sometimes principles are very clear and some rule, the decorum of the in representative house. Decorum, what is decorum? It's a rule, but rule can be also very vague, ambiguous. That is not a question of interpretation in the sense of imprecision or not imprecision. And incomplete rules are open also to balancing. Also, Alexia admit it. But when it's complete rule, we can, after the interpretation, apply it to the case. So, in principle, we can never directly resolve a case. We can only open the argumentation chain to justify the application of some rule. That is different. And this clear, I allows, or he allows, I don't know if you speak, I allows, the judge is to confront with the work in Hercules, Judge Hercules. And then here, the stabilization can only be reached if you have, Stine, if you have this complex connection between consistency and social adequacy. That's the two aspects, openness of the law and closure of the law. That is the paradox. And that is how to process this paradox is a form to reach stabilization. Luisa Hedler is with the new technology. I would say now the new technology can help a lot for routine cases. But in controversial cases, we need the judge laws to analyze. It's very difficult now to say that we have a robot to discuss the case of lands of indigenous people in Brazil. There is a big discussion, it's very open. We cannot settle this case with technology. But you said that now regulation of this internet law is very principle-based. And that is a problem. I agree with you. We need a clear rule, some principle to give possibility of development of the law with the time. But anyway, not the overestimation of principle. But we can speak later about it. Yeah? Thank you very much. Francis Cal, the temporality is very important. The problem and the critical perspective, and I can only say that principles are very flexible in time. And the problem is when you, Martonio, spoke only of principle and you underestimate the rule, this change, this variety is very strong. There is no redundancy. And then the system cannot be able to construct autonomy because there is a strong variety and very limited redundancy with the change of decision. There is no precedents that one can take seriously. In the context of Brazil, it's very clear in the Supreme Court. And then here we have, we can speak more later over austerity, because austerity comes also inside of law. And this principle can also have destructive impact on the law. A constitutional amendment in Brazil took place through the reference to the austerity principle. And with this amendment, we remove a lot of important rules of the protection of education, health, and then principles are very flexible and make possibility of this change without redundancy. Cristiano Moita, there is different levels of symbolic constitutionalization, and your research is very interesting because also at the international level we have the symbolic force of human rights, and the organization in the judicial power, the Rechtsprechungsgewalt to the judiciary is also an organization inside of the legal system. And this organization is so corrupt sometimes, but all other organizations, at least the police in Brazil, that it's make it somehow improbable a form of redundancy to construct autonomy. Then I find your findings very, very interesting, and we can then later discuss more. The instability you speak, this is the problem, the instability of expectation. You can once have a decision by Judicial against Lula to the position of minister, but the same case later with Moreira Franco changed, and they don't try to have a monocratic decision. That is a chaotic, and this brings to instability of expectation because it's eroded by the political interest of the judge. Now to Professor Bora, I agree with you that the problem of Überlagerung and superimposition is part of the systemic reproduction. There is Überlagerung without the loss of autopoiesis. That's clear. Maybe I had to qualify. I qualify in the text. There is politicization of the law and legalization of the constitution, juridification of the politics through constitution. Mueller's have an article, Constitution, European Constitution, politicization of law and juridification of politics. That's truth. Structural coupling, interpenetration, there is some Überlagerung and also truth organization. The problem I refer is not this problem. I am saying that the organization is all very corrupted. If you go to the police in Brazil, the police can every day kill a lot of people, poor people, black people, without any consequence. That's all day. Freixo, a politician, say that the case of Marcelo that was killed by the police is 600 per year in Brazil without the consequence. Then difficult is to be according to law in the police in Brazil. That organization that can take in sense of construct the autopoiesis. Luhmann, in reference to my work, he says in Das Recht der Gesellschaft clearly, when es gibt extreme corruption, there is not possibility of autopoiesis. He said clearly, that's not my affirmation, but the problem, the students of Luhmann in German, they strongly concentrate in the first period of his theory, and this discussion about periphery, they have it taken not seriously. All stick there, all people think that autopoiesis is in Burundi, autopoiesis of law. Autopoiesis of law in Swazilandia. that's very difficult to affirm this very strong presupposition of an autopoietic system under this condition. Then I would only the different form of Überlagerung. One that have to do with systemic corruption, and other that has not to do with it, but with structural coupling or interpenetration, or as Teubner wanted, interference. Now to Lincoln, I agree with you that strongly we have a very strong labor law. Professor Thornhill, when he came and he saw the image of our labor court, and he said, that is better than in England. But I said, no, that's judicialization. That's very interesting. But we have now in Brazil 900,000 of people are working under slave condition. And there is no clear reaction of the state. Then the situation, everyday situation of the worker are under the condition established by law. For example, 1/4 of the Brazilian society the worker that live under work and receive under a half salário minimum wage against the law. Then it's very symbolic construction in Gilberto, I agree, and I now for Lasha. I agree that we have the world society emerging according to Luhmann, Teubner, Rafael de George, and also in capitalism, the world system of Wallenstein. But as Wallenstein and Luhmann later, not only economics say, this system, world system, have a bifurcation between centers and peripheries. And we can only understand this world society if we understand the colonization process, the imperialism, this bifurcation of development has strongly to do with this condition of world society. Then, in this way, Maria Eduarda Dantas wrote a dissertation affirming that I am a post-colonial, a decolonial. I have a good contact, but it's another form of argumentation. But there is some coincidence. I am influenced by the dependence theory, and under influence of this theory of Celso Furtado, Young, Fernando Ricardo, I developed my work. And this theory tried to show this asymmetry of power. My new book, Transdemocracy, I am working, is precisely of the impact, negative impact, the externalization society from Lessenisch. I speak of externalization democracy. They are very proud internally of rule of law and due process of law, but to outside they are very destructive of the condition, sometimes to distract the democratic experience as in dictatorship of Brazil. Also with Allende, that is the American was very involved with Iraq, and then to Martonio, Martonio, I agree that this central count, dominant centers, in international relations, they are distracting the condition of life of other peoples with a imperialistic notion of human rights and democracy. And this selective position that the United States have a very good relation, for example, with Arabia Saudi Arabia, and it's very strong against Venezuela. But in Venezuela, we have election. Its dictatorship is very strong. Then out Guantanamo, they decided that there is a legal black hole, legal black hole, because they could do what they want, because it's not national law, it's not international law. It was to not be controlled through foreign people, through America that was in Guantanamo. They find some habeas corpus, but for foreigner, there was no possibility to a protection of national law, neither to a protection of international law, nor to a protection from American law. Then that's clear. But what they say, they have benefit of this bifurcation. Colonialism, imperialism gave a lot of condition for inclusion in this account. There is exclusion, as Friedrich Müller, but it's secondary exclusion. There is corruption, but it's not taking the whole structure, for example, of police in Brazil, because the extreme inequality, the broad exclusion of broad part of the population make some people privileged, and this over citizen, they can use, abuse, and misuse or disuse the legal system. And we have very limited reaction by the structure of power, judicial power. In this sense, the organization judicial power, they live at the margin of the law. If you see the income, they receive more than the Constitution allowed. 70% of the judges, according to official transparency system, receive more than they can receive. But there is no reaction. That's something very interesting. There is transparency of the corruption, but there is no. And I was in the National Council of Justice with a strong judge from Rio and São Paulo, desembargadores, judges of the second level. It was quite impossible because there is a lot of forms to avoid a penalty. Then that is a very strong structure of exclusion with privilege over citizenship and under citizenship with implosion of constitution. That is a problem of peripheral countries, very strong. But I say also that now with Trump, all these things, and all extreme right, there is a peripheralization of the center. That's not to negate it. And Luhmann, at the end of das Rechtsgesellschaft, he say that an autonomous law relevant for society maybe will be proven that it's an anomaly of Europe. But this anomaly can finish this anomaly with the time. He says, now I can see that what I was speaking all this time is anomaly of Europe. All this theory is for Europe, but he says maybe Europe in the future has also no autopoietic law.